please don't skip the video. There are so many difficult concepts that I have tried to explain here, and kindly listen to it again and again, because you cannot answer the quiz if you missed this video. Thank you. So my dear students, we continue our lesson on what religion is based on our exploration of this question from critical realism and through the various principles by which we try to see what religion is in terms of ontological realism, epistemic perspectivalism, and judgmental rationality. Now, we have already defined religion in the previous video, and what we're going to do now is we continue to explore the definition by which I have provided you last time. Now, it is important that I have to reiterate here with regards to religion. The basis actually is the practice, not the belief system. So, to clarify this last central point in the definition of religion, religion now is not most fundamentally a cognitive or existential meaning system. I believe we are all familiar with these meaning systems. This meaning system by which we have tried to see religion as a meaning-making process. But this definition is essentially a set of practices aimed at accomplishing things that humans consider to be good and avoiding bads. Now, cultural meaning system is necessary to tell religious people what religious practices to perform, how to perform them, and why are to be performed. But the meaning making is not the heart of religion, not by our own definition. The heart is undertaking practices to realize goods and avoid bads, especially obtaining blessings and avoiding and coping with misfortunes and crises. Now, that shifts this theory away from the dominant theme of theories of religion during much of the last century, wherein religion is considered as a cultural meaning system, and towards a focus on practice, perform, activities engaged, and their desired results. So, it's very clear from this definition that it is not subjective. For many of us, religion has now become reduced to what I or what a certain group believed in. But this is deficient in the sense that in terms of beliefs, although we might have some sets of dogmatic principles, for example, but not everybody will be able to understand it. And like, for example, the concept of consubstantial in Christian religion. Well, we often try to recite that in the Nicene Creed every Sunday for Catholic Christians. But does it really make sense to us? Well, for some theologians and some, well, shall we say, erudite Catholics, that make sense. But generally, the people at the grassroots doesn't really know what it is all about. But on the other hand, they understand that they have to go to Mass every Sunday, or at least they go to Mass once in a while, because it is part of their identity as Catholics. So, their identity as Catholics is not necessarily tied to the understanding of theological concepts or doctrines of the faith, but by their practice, they identify themselves as Catholics. And the same is true also for those who are just going to the church during Good Fridays, like for the procession or during Aguinaldo. Now, do you really think that they are well catechized, that they are sophisticated in their understanding of the doctrines of the church? No, they don't. But they identify themselves as Catholics by the practice that they do, and that's to go to Mass, for example, during Aguinaldo or during attend processions during the Good Friday ceremonies. Now, for them, that is what is meant by the definition here of religion based on our understanding in what I am proposing here, based on the writings of Christian Smith. Okay, so what are the types now of religious practices? There are various ways by which religion is being practiced. So the first one, and this is taken from Martin Weisbrand. I don't know if this is the correct pronunciation of his name, but anyway. The first one is the interventionist practice. Now, this could involve establishing contact in the sense of manipulation, for example, by wearing amulets or performing magical acts, temporary interaction, or even fusion with the superhuman powers as experienced in mystical trance and ascetic ecstasy. Or it is activating superhuman potential that slumbers within a person, including practices of self-improvement to contemplation and enlightenment. And this type also includes symbolic actions, facilitating interactions with the superhuman powers, like through prayers, chants, gestures, formulas, sacrifices, vows, and divination. So these are classified as interventionist because it tends to connect the believer or the practitioner with the superhuman powers, depending on his or her own understanding of what the superhuman powers are. Now, we have already discussed that in the previous video. Now, behavior regulating practices. This is another set of practices that are considered religious. So, it is behavior regulating practices. Now, this pertains to the religious reshaping of everyday life with respect to superhuman powers, usually concerned about the avoidance of sanctions or the accumulation of merits. And such regulations regarding behavior are, however, valid as a religious practice only when they occur in accord with the will, the principles, and sanctions of the superhuman powers. Again, these are the things that you do in relation to the superhuman power, but you do this in a way that you modify your behavior or regulate your behavior. Shall we say, for example, the practice of following, in the Jewish tradition, for example, the Jewish religion, they have so many sets of laws that are what Jesus has been talking in the gospel as the traditions of the fathers. And sometimes Jesus would condemn it. Now, that is an example of a behavior regulating practice. Like, in the morning before you wake up, not before you wake up. In the morning after you wake up, for example, those strict religious men and women, Jewish, they would say certain prayers, and that prayers is intended to praise the Lord, for example, because of a life that is given back to them, the soul that returned. But part of that is a regulation on, for example, how many steps from the bed to the sink. There's a provision in that, because the Jews, for example, especially the ultra-Orthodox Jews, they would have to wash their hands after waking up. And now that is an example of a behavior regulating practice. Now, washing your hands actually doesn't really mean to be religious in itself, because we do wash our hands for various reasons, like we wash our hands before we eat, but that is not a religious practice. Why? Because it's not connected to the superhuman powers. It's to wash our hands clean for hygienic purposes. But if you wash your hand after, in the Jewish tradition, after waking up, well, that becomes religious because it is connected to the laws of purity or impurity. Or just like, for example, you go to a masjid or a mosque, you wash your feet and hands and mouth, but the act itself has nothing to do with religion. But it becomes religious precisely because it is connected with the superhuman powers. No? And that is because you're entering into the sacred precincts, and therefore you have to be purified, as symbolized by such gestures or acts that are behavior regulating practices. The third one is the discursive practices. Now, what are discursive practices? It refers to the interpersonal communication regarding the nature, status, or accessibility of superhuman powers, their manipulability and their will, as well as techniques of self-empowerment. The discursive practices, hands down, and revise religious knowledge concerning in the interventionist practices and stand in the dialectical relationship with that knowledge. They're the foundations of an interpretive culture. So to make this very difficult definition simple, that is where theology enters now. Theology is a discursive practice, and of course and other ways by which you deliberate on doctrines and so on and so forth. Okay, now the lines of these practices are not really very sharp, and there is some sort of, shall we say, crossing or intermingling, no, or kind of a what we call this one, an interface among the three religious practices. Now, according to the author, Rice-Brown, social science or logical and methodological reasons privilege held in high regard the interventionist practices over behavior regulating and discursive practices and theorizing. Now, that is because, as we already mentioned here, we are focusing on the practice, on the manner by which the practitioner or the believer, if you want to use that word, connects with the superhuman powers. So, okay. Now, let us look at the interventionist practices. So, what are these in this clearer form? Now, these include, number one, calendrical practices, the calendar, the observing of religious calendars that marks time, typically around themes. So, calendrical. Now, the themes are three: vegetative themes, astrological cosmic, and salvation historical. Okay, so that's vegetative. Now, this is the calendar that is based on the seasons, for example, or when to plant. And there are religions by which they celebrate festivals in relation to seasons. For example, let's have an example. The Feast of the Tabernacles among the Jews, for example. Well, of course, it's already in the Torah, but if we're going to look at it, it's almost agricultural, vegetative. Why? Because it celebrates like the harvest, so of this particular plants that they use to wave as an offering. No? Another example of vegetative can be like the harvest festival, the autumn festival, like the before the Thanksgiving. Thanksgiving is not really, well, it has also historical roots, but it has it has a connection also with the harvest. No? And Shamhain, the Samhain, which is has become for us the Halloween, for example, is connected to that vegetative practice or calendrical theme. Why? Because it represents the autumn harvest festival. Actually, the Samhain or the Halloween is a vegetative festival commemorating or thanking the nature with the harvest. Not just like we have a lot of pumpkins, for example. You know, see the pumpkins. Well, because of the excess in the harvest, and that's why we have plenty of those in places where we celebrate Halloween in this manner. So these are example of vegetative. Okay, so another one is the astrological cosmic. Now, again, for example, the celebration of the vernal equinox. But these are related more to the ancient practices, no, ancient religions. So, like this, they said that the story of Tammuz, I think Tammuz, is related to the spring and harvest. And another one is the ceremonies related to Persephone, the daughter of Demeter. Again, it's terms of the harvest and the planting season, and then the harvest season. Another one, there is that male god. It represents the corn. I forgot na. So he dies, he was sacrificed, and then he resurrected. Actually, it's a representative of the corn, or something like that. I forgot na the specific god. Almost, I'm not sure if it was Adonis or something. But anyway, it's not that important anyway. So another one is the salvation historical. Now this is very clear for us Catholics. Like our calendar is a narration of the salvific act of God in history, and so we begin with with Advent and ending up with Christ the King. So the Lent. Why am I saying Lent? Because today is Lent. We are now in the Lenten season. The Advent begins the calendar. Why? Because it represents the longings of the prophets, the patriarchs, and the kings before the Messiah arrived. So it's almost like the Advent season is the historical or the salvation historical narration of the Old Testament, the longings of the patriarchs, the kings, and the prophets for the coming Messiah. And then, of course, the Christmas season is very obvious. It tells about the birth of the Lord. And then the Lenten season, the preparation for the Easter. But actually, the Lent is also connected to the spring, because actually Lent is it's an old Germanic language. Word that means something like springtime. And so the Lenten season is related to the spring season. That's why it's it's always close to the spring of March 21, the vernal equinox. And what else? We also have the end of the calendar of the Catholics. It ends with Christ the King, and that represents the coming of Jesus in history, but it will yet to happen in the future. So that's an example of salvation historical. All right, so those are examples of the interventionist practices that are revolving around three themes: the calendrical, the next one is the life cycle practices. Now, in the Catholic tradition, it's very clear, the sacraments. So the life cycle practices, which are performed on occasions of birth, into interreligious community, the affirmation of the latter by young adults, like in initiation, marriage, dying, and death. Now that is very clear in the Catholic tradition. So we have baptism, marking the birth or accompanying the birth cycle, not the birth cycle. There's no birth cycle in the Christian tradition, but the occasion of birth, the birth event, baptism. That's why we have infant baptism, very close to the birth of the child in this world, the physical birthing of the child. And the baptism represents the birthing of the child into the what we call as the life of the church, or life in the spirit, whatever term you might want to use. And another example is confirmation. Confirmation actually is conducted as a sign of maturity, and it is a kind of, before it was a kind of initiation to adulthood, but of course nowadays we don't have a parallel in the society about initiation practices, but more or less confirmation is almost parallel to that. And of course marriage, you know that. And then being sick, which is part of the life cycle, becoming old, becoming sickly, so we have the anointing. And of course, when we die, the last anointing or the extreme unction. Okay, so it's very clear in the Catholic tradition how these interventionist practices are related to the life cycle practice. And then the third one are variable practices. So these are actually referring to that reaction to unforeseen events, diseases, natural catastrophes, love sickness, like sudden death, political crisis, and poor harvest. No, so the common themes in many religious practices are worship and veneration, the marking of passages, the making of sacrifices and exchanging, fasting and feasting, and so on and so forth. And also pilgrimages and other forms of crossings are important religious practices. And we have also to understand that the practitioners of these practices differs in their qualifications. So there is the practice that is done, performed by the masses, and then there is the practices that are done by the virtuosi of this particular group, or those who are adepts. In our language, as Catholics, we might call this the lay persons, the ordained, and the religious. So, for example, among the lay persons, the practices that are meant to be done by the lay persons are not the same, are not of the same rigidity or variability as that of the, or rather, rigidity or vigor. No, that's what I mean, not variety, but the vigor compared to that of a religious. So a lay person is not expected to do what the nuns, for example, in the Carmelite monasteries are doing. That they are not, for example, being cloistered. No? So that is not expected of the lay persons. So you can see here that the practice of the general practice can also be modified, becoming more rigorous compared to the rest of the other members of this particular group. At the same time, there is also such specialization in the rituals. So we can say that there are persons designated to be adepts in the ceremonies of the particular religion, and that the others cannot master. Okay, so because in some other religions, the ceremonies are very complex, and it requires special training. And that is not very obvious in the Catholic tradition or in the Christian tradition, because most of us are just merely like, if you are a Protestant, if you're attending a Protestant service, all they do is just talk and sing. But even then, talking and singing demands a little practice, or a certain amount of practice and expertise. But in other religions, that involves intricate and complex ceremonies, you really need to train for a long time for that. No, you just cannot just perform the ceremonies on your own without the supervision and training needed to acquire such practices. Okay? Okay. Now, the question now is, so, if religion now is practiced, how about its relation to the beliefs? Isn't it that we have to believe first, then we have to practice? Well, actually, it doesn't happen in the real world. Now, for example, when we baptize little children, when we baptize them, you don't understand what the faith is all about. And even if we grow up, we really don't understand much about what our faith is telling us. But we undergo the practices. So we just have our babies, for example, baptized. We send them to Mass, or rather we go to Mass. We send them to the Catholic schools if they can afford it, or to catechism, or my Flores de Mayo to have their catechism. They have to do it. By doing, they come to understand. No? So now people need to start engaging in the prescribed practices, and it is hope. As a result, they should over time find themselves transformed in spirit and mind. So by the very act of practicing prescribed religious practices, by performing the prescribed religious practices, they will come to understand, hopefully, what this is all about. So, practices, in other words, are formative and not simply expressive. What does it mean? It is formative because as you practice, as you perform the prescribed practices, you come to understand. While when you say expressive, you just perform what you know already. No? So coming from what you believe, what you're understanding, and then you express it. No, that is not. Practices are formative. In other words, by doing, you understand. So you do first, and then you understand. It is not always that you understand first, and then you do. That is not the way things happens. Okay? Just take for example, in the Jewish tradition, a rabbi at the synagogue does not teach the members of his congregation that they should try to feel generous first and then they give alms. No. Rather, what is being taught is they practice giving alms, the tzedakah, to whether they like it or not, do it. In fact, it is a prescription in the practice of tzedakah or alms giving that even if you don't feel giving, give. Because by the act of giving, you are formed. There's even that question posed to one rabbi, which is better, to give 100 pesos one time or to give 1 peso 100 times? Of course, this I'm just trying to convert the amount to a more understandable currency. So, which is better? To give 100 peso bill one time or to give 1 peso 100 times? You may answer differently depending upon your opinion. But basing this from formative versus expressive, the answer is, it is better to give 1 peso 100 times rather than to give 100 peso once. The reason behind is this, because the more you give, 1 peso today, 1 peso the next day, it becomes a habit. You are being formed until the time will come that you don't mind giving again and again and again. Sometimes kita, and this is I think the fault of so many preachers and even priests sometimes are, well, guilty of this, that we have stop making our religious practices as formative because they have emphasized too much the expressive aspect of practices rather than the formative. And a very good example is this. Like some schools, they would, it is mandated by some Catholic schools that their students should attend their churches. Whether you're Catholic, you go to a Catholic church. If you're a Protestant, you go to your own churches also, to your denomination or congregation. And then you have your attendance checked by the pastor or by the youth minister or whoever's in charge of this particular activity. Some priests, I've heard this, some Catholic priests would go against it. They would not want it because it seems that they have the impression that you are forcing the child to go to Mass when supposedly it is by their own volition that they go to Mass. The question is, how can they go in their own volition when you have not formed them to go to Mass in the first place? If you're going to wait for the child to develop the desire to go to Mass, it will take years. And sometimes it may not even develop because after all, you have not formed them to have a taste or to have the habit of going to Mass. So, I think I think we should continue that practice of really requiring students to go to Mass and have their attendance checked. Because that is an example of how practices are formative. You are forming them to acquire the habit of performing the prescribed practices. And later on, they would come to understand their faith. Nga, sa totoo lang. Tanan kita, nga nagasilimba, really knows what our faith is in its complex sets of doctrines. Well, even I myself cannot memorize everything. And I don't even claim to comprehend everything in our faith, even though I studied theology. How much more those who did not study theology? I can have difficulty in explaining the consubstantiality of Jesus. Jesus consubstantial with the Father. It's difficult. Does it mean that I am less Catholic? Or does it mean if I understand consubstantiality, I am better Catholic than those who cannot understand? Of course not. But if I don't go to Mass, even if I claim to be Catholic, if I don't go to Mass, that doesn't count. You see? A very good example is this. Biden, the current president of the United States, claimed that he is a devout Catholic. But is he devout really? Well, he goes to Mass every Sunday. Okay. So he does the prescribed practices. However, he also condones abortion. And that is against the behavior regulating practices of this particular tradition. And that is why, therefore, it becomes really a dilemma even among the bishops of the United States, whether how to deal with this Catholic president by name and by, shall we say, practice, because he goes to Mass every Sunday. But at the same time, he also has practices that are going against the behavior regulating practices of this religion. So how would you resolve that? Yeah. So that's one thing that we have to discuss in our class during our live discussion. Okay, so hopefully you take note of this. All right. So, another example, an American evangelical does not say to himself that he should get the feel of being spiritual and then they pray to God. No. Rather, You just need to start praying. And that will help you get more spiritual. Hindi nga, okay, I have to feel good first, I have to feel spiritual and I pray. That's expressive. But that is not really what is happening. Or what should happen in terms of religion. Religion demands that you pray. Just like, for example, the Muslims pray for 5 times. Do you think really that they really love to pray? But it is because it is mandated. And so, an example, as I was saying, is the Muslim. They have to pray 5 times a day. Do you really think that they really love to pray 5 times a day? No, I'm not sure. But I think if they are humans, sometimes they also got bored with it. No? I believe, just a presupposition. But they prayed because that is mandated by that's the prescribed practice. And by their prescribed practice, they feel what is ought to be filled if that is given to them. Okay? So, that's it, I think. Now, religions are constituted not by the practitioner's subjective intentions. Now, this is very important. Because in our understanding of religion now, we have become so subjective, especially with the so-called lived religion. Nga, kung ano yung ako na phenomenologically, yun na yun. But, well, that is a representative thinking of subjectivism, that you are actually getting away the role of institutions from the life of the people and making it individualistic. That's why lived religion, you have heard a lot of it. No? It's all about lived religion. It's my experience of God. So, yun. But in our perspective of critical realism, religions are constituted not by the practitioner's subjective intentions at a given time, regardless of what you feel. At any given time, that's not, what I feel doesn't define my religion. No? So, rather, religion is defined by or constituted by institutional and publicly objective elements, such as traditions, cultures, sacred texts, and established liturgy. Okay, so what constitutes religion is not your experience, which is often the substance of the so-called lived religion, lived religiosity. Well, maybe that is how you feel, but it doesn't define religion. And that makes the things messier actually nowadays. Why? Because they now define this as being spiritual but not religious. Well, that may work, but how it is problematic in the sense that so that means if you have if you are subjectively experiencing your own spirituality and you do not define yourself within certain categories of religious tradition, then you become nuns, no? Just like N-O-N-E-S. And many of our American, many of the Americans, well, the young and not so young, are becoming nuns because they are not identifying themselves with any religious institution. And that, I think, is another thing that we can discuss. No? We have eliminated from the discourse what we call as the religiousness. So, what is religiousness? Religiousness is a matter of the practitioner's variable subjective beliefs, as well as how often they perform and how meaningful they find religious practices. No? So that is religiousness. So, I am spiritual but not religious. They identify their religious in terms of the institution rather than religiousness as the variable subject. Sa bagay, in the first place, actually, what we can have here is that the spiritual is actually can be expressed as religiousness. You see the point? So in other words, everyone has this religiousness as a variable subjective element in your belief. Okay?